Brilliant. Thank you so much. So it gives me great. Okay. It gives me great pleasure to introduce. We kept the best speaker for last, Elise Woodard. So we're going to give her the last word. Thanks very much for joining us. And sorry we couldn't move the workshop a little bit later so you could be part of the whole thing.
Oh, no worries at all. I'm sorry I couldn't make it earlier. But yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you all today about this idea called epistemic atonement. And I'll connect it and motivate it to some in relation to some work on epistemic blame as well. Okay, so I put some slides and a handout in the chat. You don't need them. I'll be sharing my screen, obviously, but I don't know. I like to have a handout as a souvenir, and if you need anything for a reference during Q&A, it's all there. Okay, cool. So the idea that I'll be motivating today is this idea called epistemic atonement. And the basic idea is this: we sometimes make epistemic mistakes, we change our minds and sometimes therefore improve, but changing our minds is not often enough. We sometimes need to do something more, and that something more is what I'm calling epistemic atonement. Okay, cool. So I'm first going to offer you a series of examples that I think motivate the notion of epistemic atonement as something that we need an account of. And I want to suggest that expectations of atonement are already part of our testimonial practices. So this is the example that first got me thinking about the topic, and it involves Joe Biden. So Biden was a longstanding supporter of the Hyde Amendment, which bars the use of federal funds to pay for abortion in most cases. On June 6, 2019, he changed his mind, ostensibly after intense criticism, both from fellow Democrats and people further on the left. So perhaps surprisingly, after the change, Biden was subject to intense criticism, especially by people who thought that he made the right change. And moreover, some of the criticism appeared to be epistemic in nature. So for example, he was criticized for offering flawed reasoning for changing his mind, for offering insufficient reason for changing his mind now, as opposed to sooner. So for example, he noted that women's rights are under attack nowadays, and this led some commenters to balk, so different from all the other days, suggesting that his reason for changing his mind now was insufficient. Third, he changed his mind in response to public pressure. And this might lead you to question not only the genuineness of the change, but also his capacity to be epistemically autonomous going forward. And then finally, he was criticized for being metaphorically stuck in the 1980s and not looking for new evidence around him. And I want to suggest that cases like Biden's abound within politics. So for example, politicians who voted for the Iraq War still have this blemish leveraged against them, even though they've since denounced this decision. And this seems like a partly epistemic criticism, right? We're criticizing them for their poor judgment, not just the terrible consequences that followed from that judgment. Another type of case that I think goes beyond politics, but also includes it, include cases where we say an agent should have known better. So Sandy Goldberg and others talk about this sort of case. So one example they offer involves like a doctor who say fails to keep up to date with the most current prescription practices. And we might say they should have known better, given the sort of legitimate expectations we have on doctors to keep up with this changing information. This also sometimes occurs in politics. So in a relatively recent article, Bernie Sanders was criticized by a journalist for having once praised the Soviet Union. And the criticism that was offered was that he should have known better. And the idea that I'm arguing is that even though someone does know better now, that doesn't mean that they're sort of the slate is wiped clean, that they don't need to make up for the fact that they failed to know better sooner. Moreover, I want to suggest that although these criticisms are very natural and very commonplace, I think they're quite puzzling without a notion of epistemic atonement, right? So we brought that out earlier by noting that it's somewhat surprising that the people who pressured Biden to change his mind then criticized him for failing to do so. So I think atonement will help us understand what's going on there. That said, I recognize that all of these cases involve noise, like they involve the role of a politician or of a doctor. But one, I don't think that atonement is always confined to these roles, like these professional roles. And moreover, but another worry that you might have is that these cases all involve like moral issues at stake. So I want to give you another hypothetical, but still, I think, realistic example that involves Marjorie. And there are still moral issues, I think, weaved in here, but I think that they're a little bit less salient than in some of the other cases where there are clear sort of consequences at stake. Okay, so this case is called Truther, and it goes like this. So you and Marjorie have recently become good friends through a college class. And one day, Marjorie reveals that she used to be a 9/11 truther, so committed to the view that 9/11 was an inside job committed by the US government. And moreover, she only abandoned that view 6 months ago. So she now believes the quote unquote official account that Al-Qaeda was responsible for the attacks. So I want you to reflect on what your reactions would be to Marjorie in light of this revelation. And you can always like substitute, your favorite conspiracy theory if you don't like this one. So would you just file this away as a sort of random quirky trivia fact about Marjorie, akin to if she told you that her hair color used to be purple? Are your concerns about her epistemic inclinations or dispositions fully assuaged by the fact that she's since changed her mind? And I think for many of us, the answer to these questions is no. So you might wonder aloud or to yourself, how could you have ever believed that in the first place? And you might have some questions for Marjorie, like, why did you change your mind? Why did you form that belief initially? And I think you would want some further explanation before coming to trust her again. And I think in the meantime, you would plausibly reduce trust in her, at least on some matters. Okay, I think we can start to probe this atonement intuition a little bit further. So imagine that someone criticizes Marjorie for a previous failure to believe in accordance with the evidence, or believing in a biased way, or negligent evidence gathering, whatever the case may be. There are different ways to fill out the sort of putative epistemic mistake that she's making here. I think she can't easily dismiss this criticism by just pointing to the fact that she now believes in accordance with the evidence. And here we can compare the moral domain. So imagine that your friend Amir fails to pick you up from the airport on time simply because he forgot. So when you call him, asking him where he is, he admits to having forgotten, and he says, I'll leave right away, and he ends up arriving 45 minutes late. Amir can't rebuff criticism by just noting that he eventually got there, right? He still needs to apologize for having forgotten, for arriving late, however you want to fill it in. And I want to suggest something similar is true for Marjorie. So even though she got, more metaphorically this time, where she ought to have gotten all along, she still needs to make up for that gap, the fact that she failed to get there sooner. I noticed there are a few more people here, so I'll just share the slides in the handout again. Again, they're just for reference. Okay, I think we can start to summarize some of the parallels that we've been seeing so far. So first, there's this structural similarity between the two cases of Amir and Marjorie. So in each case, an agent ought to phi at some time T1. They failed to do so, but they do succeed at phi-ing at some later time T2. Each needs to make up for the fact that they failed to phi earlier, right? They need to make up for this gap. Second, in terms of trust withdrawal, I think it would be odd, even inappropriate, to fully trust either Amir or Marjorie in the absence of some sort of atonement, some sort of acknowledgement, apology, and so on. And then finally, I think there's something amiss about a failure to atone. And we brought that out by noting that these agents can simply rebuff criticism by noting that they eventually got where they needed to go. Okay, so what more do we want from Marjorie? So here I'm just going to flag some possibilities, and we'll come back to some of these later. And my account will essentially unify them. So one, we might want an explanation for her initial belief. So why did she believe the conspiracy theory in the first place? Second, we might want an explanation of why she changed her mind, right? So we might want to know, did she just bump her head and wake up with a new belief? Or did she sort of come to a reasoned view about this? And I think we want to know how she changed her mind or why she changed her mind because it helps us assess her, sort of epistemic dispositions or her ability to be epistemically autonomous going forward. Third, we might want her to take responsibility. And finally, we might want her to express some sort of negative attitude toward her past doxastic record. Like, I can't believe I used to believe that. It was just wild. So why do we want these things? So again, this is foreshadowing the account I'll offer later. But I think we want them because they help us regain trust in Marjorie. Trust that I think is broken when you've learned about her past doxastic record. And here we can compare the moral domain, a comparison I'll keep coming back to. In the moral domain, many people think that one sort of function of atonement or apologies is to restore trust in the violator. Okay, so that concludes the initial practice-based motivation for the view. Now I want to move on to some more theoretical motivations and address the source of skepticism that you might have so far. And here's where I'm going to situate this project and motivate it within the epistemic blame literature. So basically, like one sort of move here is that if you already like the idea of epistemic blame, then you should also like the idea of epistemic atonement. Of course, the former is not necessary, but I think it helps. It helps give you one further motivation. Okay, so one type of skepticism comes from reflecting on potential disanalogies between the moral and the epistemic domains. So I'm arguing that there's this symmetry between the two domains that's been overlooked, but you might think that's wrong, and you might think that's wrong for at least two reasons. So one, it appears that epistemic mistakes, like purely epistemic errors, don't have any victims, and so there's no one to atone or apologize to. And then second, you might worry that certain reactive attitudes are inappropriate in the epistemic domain. And you might think that that suggests that demands for atonement are similarly inappropriate. Okay, so I have two quotes that I think channel this type of skepticism. So first we have Jessica Brown, who writes, epistemic failings aren't associated with resentment, the demand for punishment, or compensation. Nor would it seem appropriate for the subject of the failing to feel guilty, apologize to others, or recompense them. And similarly, we have Adam Piavarki, who writes, genuine apologies seem out of place in the case of epistemic blameworthiness, and epistemic guilt doesn't seem like something that we experience. So both of these authors are writing on epistemic blame, and what they seem to be suggesting is that although the notion of epistemic blame is appropriate, the notion of epistemic atonement might not be. So as I sort of alluded to earlier, I want to suggest that far to the contrary, the literature on epistemic blame further supports the need for an account of epistemic atonement. So more generally, I want to offer you three theoretical arguments for thinking that we sometimes need to epistemically atone for epistemic mistakes. So we don't just need to rely on intuition pumps that I offered earlier. Okay, so here's the overview of those three theoretical considerations, and then I'll go through them more slowly. So first, I think we need an account of epistemic atonement for a full account of epistemic blame and its dynamics. Second, I think reflecting on the various roles that atonement plays also further demonstrates the need for this account. And then finally, I'll suggest that some emotions and attitudes are appropriate in light of epistemic failures, and epistemic atonement can help people sort of respond to those legitimate reactions. Okay, so first, complementing accounts of epistemic blame. So first we have Jessica Brown, who argues that epistemic blame is often accompanied by a forward-looking desire that the agent in question appreciate the epistemic reasons that she had previously ignored or flouted. And quite plausibly, epistemic atonement allows agents to demonstrate that this desire was satisfied. So a similar sort of point holds for moral blame, and indeed George Scher, on whom Brown sort of draws her account from, makes a very analogous point in the context of thinking about like apologies in the moral domain. Next, we have Adam Piavarki, who claims that what justifies our practices of epistemically blaming others is that it helps them cultivate a valuable form of agency, namely epistemic agency. And again, it seems like epistemic atonement allows such agents to demonstrate this responsiveness to epistemic reasons, which for Piavarchi is central to epistemic agency. And then finally, we have Cameron Bolt's view of what epistemic blame consists in. And on his account, epistemic blame consists in a relationship modification. So it's the Scanlonian account. And oftentimes this relationship modification takes the form of reducing trust. But then it seems like if epistemic blame sort of quintessentially involves a relationship downgrade of some kind, we also want to know, well, how could that relationship be upgraded again? And I think that atonement allows us to fill in that slot. Okay. So second, skeptics that we saw earlier focus narrowly on the victim-centered role of atonement. But atonement plays other important roles as well, beyond this just purely victim-centered role. So first, it plays an important role for the community. And so it both allows the sort of transgressor to reaffirm, oh, sorry, I misread this. It plays an important role for the offender, so it allows them to reaffirm their membership in the community, as well as their commitment to the relevant norms that they had previously violated. And second, it plays an important role for the public. It allows them to hold the agent responsible, and it offers them a certain form of assurance that the agent won't commit the same mistake again. And I think that we do need something to play these roles in the epistemic domain. So agents who are epistemically blameworthy need a way to signal that they're trustworthy again. And I think we all, as the public, have an interest in epistemic norms being reaffirmed and recommitted to. So after all, we've all seen firsthand the consequences of living in a quote unquote post-truth environment where norms on responding to evidence or even having consistent beliefs seems, optional at best and Procrustean and sort of, restrictive at worst. Okay. So finally, epistemic reactive attitudes. So as we saw, Brown and Piavarchi, as well as some others, suggest that certain attitudes are misplaced in the case of epistemic blame. So for example, guilt. But some reactive attitudes and emotions do seem appropriate. And some of these are relatively uncontroversial. So first, personally, we might experience regret, shame, embarrassment, and some people even suggest guilt. And then second, personally, we might experience non-retributive anger, frustration, disappointment, and so on. And I think plausibly, epistemically blameworthy agents want to know how to respond to these reactions and render them less appropriate, whether they're sort of self-directed, like a sort of like, shame, I'm so embarrassed, I believe that, I'm so embarrassed I made that epistemic mistake, or if it's some sort of like frustration that's directed at you. Okay, so those are the two broad motivations for this idea that we sometimes need to epistemically atone for our epistemic mistakes. So one practice-based, one theoretical. So now I want to give you a positive proposal about how to go about epistemically atoning. So the basic idea is this, and I call this trust restoration account. So to epistemically atone, what agents need to do is they need to try to restore epistemic trust and indicate epistemic trustworthiness. And by this, I just mean trustworthiness with respect to their doxastic states and belief-forming practices. So there are three main motivations for this proposal. So one is that, just as an observation, epistemic blame often involves trust reduction. Indeed, we saw this when discussing Marjorie, so it seems natural to reduce your trust in her. On some views, epistemic blame is very closely tied to this sort of phenomenon. But then it seems plausible that atonement requires restoring what was lost, namely trust. Second, I think it's intuitively motivated. So I essentially previewed this diagnosis or sort of stacked the deck in favor of my account when we first discussed Marjorie. And then finally, I think it completes this parallel that I've been arguing for to the moral domain. So it's well established both empirically and philosophically that a central function of apologies, which I'm thinking of as a sort of central paradigmatic form of atonement, is to restore trust. Okay, so how do we go about restoring trust? So this is sort of like a partial list, and I'll elaborate and give some examples in a second. It's not meant to be exhaustive. There could be other strategies one could partake in. For example, you may need to establish a better track record. And also like what sort of combination of strategies is appropriate might depend on how egregious the case was. Okay, so first you might accept responsibility. You might offer an explanation. You might express negative emotions. You might commit to improve. And you might engage in what I'm calling epistemic community service. So this is sort of like the philosophical self-help portion of the talk. So if you're ever epistemically blameworthy, here are some strategies you can appeal to sort of diffuse that. So here are some like examples just to give you a better, like more concrete sense of what I have in mind. So first, you might accept responsibility, like I acknowledge I ignored the evidence and I'm sorry about that. You might offer explanations like, I'm sorry I made that silly logic mistake. I didn't get much sleep last night. You might express negative emotions like, I feel so embarrassed of my past beliefs. I can't believe I used to believe that. You might commit to improve, like I promise to avoid hasty judgments in the future. And you might engage in what I'm calling epistemic community service. And I should flag that this is a type of atonement that I don't think is best understood as a form of apology, just to show you that like the notion of atonement is sort of broader than the notion of an apology. And here's what I have in mind. So this involves, like, for example, trying to convert others. So Joshua DiPello has this really interesting discussion of reluctant converts. So an example would involve like Jatarth Jadeja, who used to be a QAnon supporter, and he's since given up those beliefs, and he now tries to convert others away from this QAnon conspiracy theory. And I think this is really valuable for at least two reasons. So one, it allows them to affirm that they're genuinely committed, like they really have changed their mind, because sometimes there can be a question about it, especially for more deep-rooted beliefs. And second, I think it plays this really valuable service role. So I just mentioned DiPello, who has a really interesting argument for thinking that quote unquote reluctant converts like Jadeja are better positioned in some ways to convert others than, for example, I would be. So for example, they'll be more empathetic in a certain way. They're better positioned. Okay, and again, this is not supposed to be exhaustive, but just to give you a sort of like flavor of what I have in mind. And also like, hopefully you can map this on to things that we do in pretty much everyday life. Like even yesterday, I got an email saying, I'm sorry for giving you misleading information. Like that's a sort of example of what I have in mind. The atonement language might be a little bit misleading, but I'm really thinking of this as a sort of like epistemic repair. All right. So I have views about how each of these things helps restore trust, sort of based partly on the empirical literature and some speculation about how this would go in the epistemic case. Of course, we would need to do actual empirical empirical work to verify this, but if you have questions about any of the putative mechanisms, feel free to ask me about it in Q&A. Okay, cool. So that's like the positive proposal for the positive proposal and sort of the main motivation for the view. Now I'm going to end by considering two types of objections. So the first objection is epistemic atonement really epistemic? And then of course the second will be, is it really atonement? So these are sort of the two objections I want to consider. Okay, so you might worry that this isn't really an epistemic thing that I'm talking about. And you might think that because, well, epistemic atonement really just reduces to moral or role-based atonement. And you might try to push that by saying, well, we only need to atone for our epistemic mistakes when they're in some ways tied to testimony or action. So we don't need to atone when they're sort of purely epistemic. But then you might worry that, good old-fashioned moral or role-based atonement can do the work. So there's nothing really genuinely epistemic going on here. So I'll call this objection the belief falls in the forest problem, and it goes like this. If epistemic atonement is purely epistemic, then there must be cases where one ought to atone for their purely private epistemic errors. But, so the objection goes, we never need to atone for our purely private epistemic mistakes. So epistemic atonement is not purely epistemic. So I think there are reasons to push back against premise 1, but I'm going to focus on premise 2. And I think that we can deny it and instead say that we sometimes do need to epistemically atone for purely private errors, at least in some sense. There's a sort of like pro tanto, reason to atone. So 1, you may need to restore self-trust. After all, you need to be able to rely on your own reasoning, and that sort of like the legitimacy of that might be compromised if you have reason to sort of distrust your ability to form, reliable beliefs about some matter, for example. Second, I think that we should distinguish between how we find out about epistemic mistakes and what we're atoning for. So the idea here is that just because we find out about these mistakes, because they manifested themselves in action or testimony, that doesn't mean that that's like what we're atoning for. So by analogy, we don't just think that people should atone for their beliefs. We don't just think that people should like apologize for getting caught. That's sort of like a paradigmatically bad apology. But the only reason we find out that they need to apologize is because they got caught. So it's sort of like it's almost like an epistemic point here. And then finally, I think we can just compare private errors in the moral domain. So suppose that you wish your neighbor, ill just because, for no good reason, just for like some petty reason. And suppose that's a moral violation. I think that there's some sort of consideration in favor of, apologizing to your neighbor or atoning, although of course it would be sort of bizarre to go up to your neighbor and knock on their door and say, oh, by the way, I had this, horrible belief about, I had this horrible wish for you. Let me apologize. I think that would freak your neighbor out even more. It would be completely bizarre. So these sorts of considerations to atone are sort of overridden, or you need to just take different strategies to atone in the sort of private context. So maybe something similar can be said here in the belief case. So we're not going to just like admit our errors to everybody. That would be, bizarre, sort of like save that for the confessional is the sort of like analogy here. But that doesn't mean that there's no sort of consideration, like fittingness consideration in favor of thinking that atonement is good, or maybe you should be disposed to atone. I'm not sure quite how to put it. And the moral case is a little bit different in some ways, but that's sort of a general type of strategy we might pursue. Okay, and now I just want to flag that I'm not committed to epistemic atonement being purely epistemic. It's really enough for me that there's something distinctively epistemic about it. It has this distinctive epistemic flavor to it, even if it's sort of unavoidably bound up with the moral and the practical. Like that's ultimately not a big problem to me, as long as there's something sort of like novel here. Okay. So last objection, I know I have like 2 minutes left, so I'll probably go through this relatively quickly, but there's not that much left. So the second objection is that epistemic atonement isn't really a form of atonement. So on my account that we saw earlier, a central role of epistemic atonement is to offer others evidence that we're sort of epistemically trustworthy agents. But then it seems like epistemic atonement plays a sort of purely evidential role, just to try to get other people to, to give people evidence that we're trustworthy again. Why is this a problem? So 1, it seems like epistemic atonement would be unnecessary if we could get this evidence in some other sort of way. But then second, it seems to motivate an apparently stark disanalogy to the moral domain. So in the moral domain, we don't just want people to apologize to us because it gives us evidence that they're a good or trustworthy person. Rather, we think that, even if we found out that Amir would never forget to pick you up from the airport again, you would still probably want him to apologize to you. And given these disanalogies, you might worry that epistemic atonement is not really atonement, at least in a way that actually parallels the moral domain, which is what I've been trying to argue. Okay, so let's take each worry in turn. So the first worry is that atonement is easily supplanted by other sort of evidence of trustworthiness. So the first thing I want to flag is that it can be practically very difficult to get this evidence of trustworthiness in other ways. So we need to know not only someone's beliefs, but also their belief-forming practices, and that takes a while to gather. So at the very least, I think that atonement provides a valuable shortcut, so it doesn't just easily drop out. But second, and I think more importantly, I think even if you could get this, this sort of evidence, I think there's reasons to prefer atonement, other forms of more impersonal evidence. So the idea here is that if you did get evidence of them being trustworthy without any atonement, this evidence would likely be impersonal. So maybe an oracle comes down and tells you that this person is trustworthy again, and so on. I think there would be reasons to prefer atonement, at least in addition to this sort of oracle evidence. And I think that's because atonement offers you a certain form of assurance that the agent won't make the same mistake again. And this also sort of raises the stakes of the transgression, because if they sort of make the mistake again, they can be doubly criticized, both for their initial violation and for failing to abide by their commitment. So this might also help you cultivate a sort of distinctive form of interpersonal trust and confidence in the agent. And this is something I still want to think about. I know this is sort of maybe a little bit rough, but I think that we should conclude here that both like moral and epistemic atonement have this interpersonal value. And that addresses the second worry. I think I'll skip this for the sake of time. Basically, the idea is that, well, maybe there's this weaker disanalogy, that the interpersonal element is more central. I'm willing to grant this, but I think it's like a little bit complicated, and I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A. Okay, cool. Like I said, I'm happy to come back to this sort of weaker disanalogy later on, if you'd like. Okay, so now I'll just wrap up by considering like a few avenues for future work, some of which I've started to think about, some of which I haven't yet. So the first is, we might ask, well, when ought agents to epistemically atone? So I've only really argued here that we sometimes do need to epistemically atone, but I haven't really told you when this duty kicks in. I've just tried to like motivate it as best I can without a full answer to that question. So we might ask questions like, do you need to be, epistemically blameworthy for this duty to kick in? Do you ever need to atone for like just excused beliefs? And I have some thoughts on this. I've gone back and forth at various times, but I have some preliminary thoughts and I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A. Okay, so second, we might ask about demands for atonement. And this I have some bonus slides on if people want to come back to it. So we might ask, well, when are demands for atonement imprudent, unfitting, or in some other way inappropriate? I think this is really important because we don't necessarily want to disincentivize changes of mind by being too quick and ready to criticize people for their epistemic mistakes. And then finally, we might ask about epistemic forgiveness and perhaps other sorts of potential parallels here. So we might ask, well, what is epistemic forgiveness? Is it equivalent to, or does it go beyond coming to trust? Do we ever owe forgiveness, and so on? Okay, so just to wrap up, I've argued that there are both practical and theoretical motivations for thinking that we sometimes need to atone for our epistemic mistakes. I propose an account of how to atone in terms of trust restoration. I defended epistemic atonement against two sources of skepticism, one focused on whether it's really atonement, and the other on whether it's really epistemic. And I sketched avenues for future work. So that's it. Thanks everyone so much. I'm looking forward to your questions.